That was a perfect song for us to sing right before this lesson because that is exactly what we're going to be talking about this morning, being more and more like Jesus. The elders this year have decided that a theme and a focus for the congregation is going to be one another Christianity. One another Christianity. Talking about the relationships that we have with one another because we have a relationship with God and how our relationships interact because of our relationship with God. And so, Lord willing, I plan this year to preach several lessons on the idea of one another and specifically going to passages in the New Testament that specifically use the phrase one another. And so, to start this year and to start this morning, I want us to consider that we need to love one another. Love one another. And of all of the one another phrases in the New Testament, this one shows up the most. 16 times specifically, the word love one another, the words love one another are used, but then it is implied without the word a countless number of times. And so the idea of loving one another is an extremely important one in the scriptures. And so, Lord willing, we're going to have more than just one lesson on this. And I want to be really honest and transparent with everybody this morning. I've been in church buildings my whole life. I've heard sermons my whole life. I've been in Bible classes my whole life. So sometimes when I hear that the lesson or the sermon or the Bible class is going to be about loving one another, my brain does this. Know that. Next, move on. We already know that. Let's do something else. And then I'm going to be real honest. As a man, there's part of me that's like, all right, here comes the mushy gushy stuff. And I'm not always comfortable with that. And then throw on top of that, how many times a day do we hear the word love on commercials from people in our society, all kinds of ways that the word love is used, that sometimes it has no meaning at all. So what are we even talking about when we're talking about love one another? And so for all those reasons, for me personally, what I want to do is go to a passage where Jesus specifically commands his disciples to love one another. And then I want to see what he meant by that, see how he showed what he meant by that, and then talk about how that can apply to us today. Sound good? Okay, go to John 13, please. John chapter 13. John 13. And while you're flipping over there, the context of John 13 is so important and so weighty. Brother Dan just mentioned how the Passover is when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And we don't see that specifically here in John 13, but that's exactly when this happened. So John 13 through 17 is sometimes called Jesus's farewell discourse, because this is the Last Supper. That's when he's telling these things. And this is right before Jesus is going to die. This is the night before he's going to have his trial and the crucifixion. And so you just think about, even people in our day and time, before they die, they want to give their most important lessons to the people that they love. They want to share the most important things before they die. I think Jesus really does something similar here. He's telling the people that he loves some of the most important lessons for them to learn. And so the setting here in John 13 is really this. Jesus knows he's about to die. He knows his disciples are going to reject him, and he knows that they're not going to fully understand until later. But he has some really important lessons that he wants to teach them right now. And so in John chapter 13, in verses 1 through 11, Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. Let's read verses 3 through 5 together. John 13, verses 3 through 5, please. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. And so, we saw there, right there in verse 3, Jesus knows exactly what's about to happen. He knows everything that's going to come. And then the master and teacher, God in the flesh, the God of the universe in flesh, does the job of the lowest slave and washes the disciples' feet. And later he says, you need to do likewise. And remember, Judas is here at this point. So Jesus even washed the feet of Judas, the one that he knew was going to betray him. And he washed his feet anyway. Okay, Joe, go down to verse 18 and 19 with me, please. 18 and 19. I do not speak of all of you. I know the ones I have chosen, but it is that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. From now on, I am telling you before it comes to pass, so that when it does occur, you may believe that I am he. So here in verses 18 and 19, Jesus is telling them again, he knows everything that's going to happen. He knows everything that's about to, and he's telling them these things, but he also says, you're not going to understand until later. When these things come about, then you'll understand. Okay, look down at verse 21 with me, please. Verse 21. When Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me. And go down to verse 26. Jesus then answered, that is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him. So when he had dipped the morsel, he took and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, what you do quickly. Now, no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. For some were supposing, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, buy the things we have need of for the feast, or else that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel, he went out immediately, and it was night. So Jesus has been saying multiple times, I know everything that's going to happen. I'm telling you now before these things take place, so that when it does, you're going to know that I was telling you the truth. He even says, one of you is going to betray me. And then he tells Judas, what you do quickly. He knows that it's Judas. And so Judas leaves. And after Judas leaves, Jesus has some really important lessons to teach. And that's what really the rest of chapter 13 through 17 is, really important lessons. But let's notice what one of the very first lessons was to his disciples at this vulnerable time when he wants the most important messages to really hit home with them. Look down at verse 33 with me, please. Verse 33. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me. And as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So here in verse 33, Jesus addresses them as little children. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a full-grown man, and I don't think I would like to be called a little child, right? But this is a term of endearment. When Jesus says little children, that is a term of love and endearment for these people. And to my knowledge, this is the only time that Jesus addresses the apostles as little children. So, I mean, he's already priming them to hear what he has to say. He's lovingly addressing them, little children. And he says, I am only with you for a little while longer. And just like I told the Jews back in John 7 and John 8, where I'm going, you can't go. And actually later down in verse 36, he's going to tell Peter, and by extension, the rest of the apostles, that you can't go where I'm going now, but you will be later. He's going back to the Father, to the one who sent him. And so later they'll be able to do that. But then he says, here is the commandment. Here's this important lesson that he wants them to hear. He says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you love one another. So what's a little weird about this to me is here in verse 34, he says this is a new commandment. Well, loving your brethren, loving your neighbor, that's not a new commandment. You know, you think about in the old law, in Leviticus 19 and verse 18, it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Do you remember that whole conversation that Jesus had with the lawyer in Luke chapter 10, where he says, good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus asks him, what does the law say? And he says, basically, love God with everything you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, yeah, do that and you'll live. And then he goes on and gives the parable of the Good Samaritan. So what makes this a new commandment? Because loving brethren and loving your neighbor, that's not a new idea. That's been around, especially in the old law. So how is this new? Well, in the Mosaic law, the Israelites were told to love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. But notice what Jesus says here is different in verse 34. He says, love one another, not as you love yourselves, but he says, verse 34, love one another even as I have loved you. Love one another that way. So no longer is the standard for the apostles here, and by extension us, no longer is the standard love your neighbor as yourself. The standard is love one another as I have loved you. Now that raises the ante a little bit. I mean, a lot of bit, right? That's huge for Jesus to say that, for Jesus to command his apostles to do that. And since this is a command to the apostles and by extension us, I mean, what kind of love are we talking about? We got to know what we mean by this. Well, the Greek word here in these verses for love is agape. And we could really go down and talk about all the different variations. Eddie preached a lesson a couple months ago. That's a great one to listen to. But this is not romantic love. It's not just friendship love. It's not family love like a mother to a child. This is selfless, unconditional love that goes beyond feelings, although it includes feelings, but it goes beyond feelings and is concerned with commitment and action. And I think the best way for us to see what kind of love that Jesus is talking about in this passage is to look at what Jesus was doing here. Because if we look at what Jesus was doing, I mean, the command was, love one another as I have loved you. So let's see what Jesus was doing. But before we do that, I want us to notice this is not the only time that Jesus says this in this farewell discourse. So look with me, if you would, at chapter 15. Chapter 15, we'll read verses 12 through 14. John 15, let's read verses 12 through 14 together, please. This is my commandment, still talking to the apostles here. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than one lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. Look down at verse 17. This I command you, that you love one another. I mean, this is not a suggestion, right? A lot of times we like to say command, example, necessary inference. I mean, this is a command from Jesus to his apostles. So we have to know what kind of love this is. So let's look at what Jesus is doing in chapter 13 and where all of this is leading to. See what Christ's love did. What kind of actions did Christ's love cause? So let's notice them together. The first one is that the love of Christ serves. The love of Christ serves. Here in John 13, verses 1 through 11, Jesus washed the disciples' feet here. The master and teacher, the God of the universe, who deserves all glory, honor, and power, did the job of the lowest servant. And even more so, he washed the feet of the one he knew was going to betray him, the one that he knew was not fully committed to him. Jesus served them anyway. Jesus served his apostles, and his commandment is, love one another as I have loved you. And so if Jesus served, then that means if we want to love one another as Jesus served, or as Jesus loved, then we must serve. And so for us, I mean, it could be anything. It could be helping somebody move stuff, delivering meals, picking up groceries. This week, it might be shoveling snow. It might be housing somebody who maybe their power goes out this week. We can serve one another in all kinds of ways. And maybe one of the struggles with serving one another is that we'll serve the people that we know well and that we like. But maybe if we don't know somebody very well, or maybe our personalities don't align very well, I'll let somebody else serve that person. Well, we need to remember, Jesus' command is, love one another as I have loved you. And Jesus served even the one he knew wasn't fully committed, the one that he knew would betray him. And Jesus washed his feet anyway. So how dare I not do that just because my personality doesn't align, or just because I don't know somebody very well? We need to love like Jesus loved, and love serves. Let's notice another thing here from Jesus is that love speaks truth. The love of Christ speaks truth. Jesus was not ashamed here in chapter 13 or anywhere to speak truth, even if it hurts in the short term, in expectation for long-term gain. Here in verses 6 through 9 of chapter 13, Jesus corrects the misunderstanding of Peter. He even outright tells Peter, you don't understand right now. I mean, it's kind of harsh, but it's the truth. He didn't understand now, but he would later. In verses 16 through 30, Jesus openly tells all the apostles, one of you is going to betray me. And then in verse 27, he tells Judas to his face. He says, what you do, do quickly. In other words, I know what you're about to do it. He knew what was going to happen. And then after the verses that we have been focusing on this morning about love, in verse 36, and verse 37, Peter says, Lord, I would even die for you. I would lay down my life for you. And in verse 38, Jesus basically just says, no, you won't. You're going to deny me 3 times. I mean, that's harsh. That would be hard for these people to hear, but Jesus spoke truth, no matter if it hurt in the short term, in expectation of long-term gain. Because he loved them, he spoke truth. And Jesus' commandment to the disciples, by extension us, is love one another as he loves. And Jesus spoke truth. So if we are going to love like Jesus loves, we must speak truth to one another. And there are a lot of people in our world today. There might even be people in the building right now or listening on Zoom that maybe you think loving one another means accepting anything and everything that somebody says or does because you love them. The idea of, well, you do you and I'll do me and we won't bother each other, right? Well, that's just not the love that Christ had for his disciples. He spoke the truth to them in love, even if it hurt their feelings in the short term, in hopes of long-term gain. And for us today, I mean, there are certainly things that we can disagree on and have no problems at all with each other. But there are other fundamental truths in the scriptures that we have to preach the truth. We have to, no matter if it hurts feelings in the short term, in prayerful expectation of long-term good, just like Jesus. And so the last one here I want to point out in John 13 and following is that the love of Christ sacrifices. Where all of this discourse is heading, all of these important lessons he's teaching his disciples, is it's leading Jesus to the cross. And we notice verse after verse after verse where Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen before it happens. We didn't even read all of them this morning. Like verse 1 is a great one. He knows everything that's about to happen, and he goes through with it anyway. He knows every detail of what's going to happen, and he goes to the cross anyway. He's going to sacrifice his life for his people because he loves them. And so Jesus' commandment in verse 34 was love one another as I have loved you. And Jesus sacrificed. And so if we want to love like Christ, we must sacrifice as well. And talking about sacrificing for one another, I think it's really similar to serving one another, but maybe it speaks more to motivations behind the service and the sacrifice. Because when we serve one another, we can be sacrificing the energy in our bodies. You know, if you've helped somebody move, a lot of you did, I appreciate it. The energy in our bodies. It could be the money in our pockets. It could be our homes. It could be any number of things, but it will cause us to sacrifice something. And as we read in John 15, verse 13, no greater love has any man than this, than he lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus was saying, I am going to the cross. I am laying down my life for my people. And so it could even cause us to lay down our lives for one another. And I don't know about you, but maybe we would say, yeah, I'd die for my brother. I would die for my sister. And at the same time, we won't go get a cup of coffee with them. We won't cook a meal for them. We would die for them, but we won't live life together. If we want to love like Christ, we will sacrifice while we're alive, and even if it causes us to lose our life. Okay, so for application this morning, I really just kind of want to say do that and close, but I know it's not that simple, and I know that because I've got a lot of work to do on these things. What I really want to do to hit this home, I want to ask every single one of us who are here, who are on Zoom, a question for us to really think about. This isn't my original question, but it really made me think about this type of love that Christ has. So here's the question. What if every single person here in this congregation loved this congregation the way that you have loved this congregation this past year? What if every single person here loved this congregation the way that you have loved this congregation this past year? Because for some in the room today, or maybe even listening on Zoom, if everybody here loved this congregation the way that you love this congregation, it would look like we never know when we're going to see each other again. It would look like we all dart out as soon as the closing prayer is over and we don't try to get to know each other. We don't want to. It would look like if volunteers are needed for something, no names would be on that list. It would look like nobody goes to work group meetings. It might look like nobody wants to have people in their homes. And so then the follow-up question to all of that is, would that be a local congregation that you would want to be a part of? Yeah, I don't think so. And I don't say any of these things to be mean or hurt anyone's feelings, because I really think that's the minority here. All of those descriptors, I really think that's the minority. We have people here who, if everybody here loved the way that they love, this place, I think, would just start levitating off the ground from all the love that's being shown and demonstrated to one another. But I really like that question because it opened up my eyes that, you know what, I've got a lot of work to do to love my brethren the way that Christ loves. And as the head of my household, my family's going to work on that this year. And I hope that you will as well. If everyone here loved this congregation the way that you have loved this congregation the past year, and if you wouldn't want to be a part of that congregation, let's make it different in 2025. As we've said a couple of times, it's a new year, you know, that things feel fresh. Let's make it different in 2025. And let's all strive to love one another as Christ loves us. And so as we close this morning, for those of us who know the love of Christ, you know what a high standard that is. If you've experienced the love of Christ in your life, you know that is a tall order. Jesus pours out his love again and again, and he still does today for anybody. There's nothing in your life that Jesus can't cleanse, not one thing. And so if you're here this morning and you're struggling with the burden of sin, and maybe it's weighing you down, and maybe on top of that, you think that this group of people will love you less because of it. We're just a people trying to love one another like Christ loves us. So give us a try. Just try it. If you are here this morning and you want to give your life to Christ today, be immersed in water, we'd love to do that. Or if you need prayers of the congregation or some other thing, whatever your spiritual need is, let it be known while we stand and sing.